Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to a new episode of the New Books Network in Psychoanalysis. I'm your host today, Akilesh Ayyar, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Dr. Richard Reichbart. Dr. Reichbart is JD PhD and past president, fellow, and training analyst at the Institute for Psychoanalytic Training and Research, a fellow of the International Psychoanalytic Association, and a member of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He's executive producer of the PEP video Black Psychoanalysts Speak and co-executive producer of the PEP video Psychoanalysis in El Barrio. In the past, he worked as a legal services attorney for Dine Beyina, you're going to forgive me for pronouncing this probably wrong, at Nahilna Be Agadite. Can you pronounce that for me better? I probably...
But you did fine.
Sorry about that. Okay. Attorneys work for the economic revitalization of the Navajo people on the Navajo and Hopi reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. And he was a civil rights worker for Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Georgia and Alabama. He's published numerous psychoanalytic articles and 3 books: Anatomy of a Psychotic Experience, Curious Stories of Diverse Places, The Cod's Earring, The Click of the Reindeer, and Other Adventures, and even Somne Poems, and The Paranormal Surrounds Us, Psychic Phenomena in Literature, Culture, and Psychoanalysis. He maintains a private practice of psychoanalysis in Hohokus, New Jersey. And today, I'm very pleased to be discussing with him his book, Anatomy of a Psychotic Experience, published by IP Books in 2022. So welcome to the show, Dr. Reichbart.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I look forward to talking to you.
Yes, me too. So this is a very, very unusual and interesting book. So I'd like you to, if you can, just describe the genesis of the book. What prompted you to write it, and where did it come from? I know there's a very interesting story behind it. So if you could share that, please.
The first part of the book was actually written as my master's thesis when I was at the University of Colorado. At the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado. I wrote it because I was going through an experience which I felt very strongly I wanted to record. I had no intention of ever publishing it because it was so revealing that I felt I couldn't do so. But years later, now that I'm an analyst and a supervising analyst and kind of long in the tooth, I decided that it was time to publish it and to look back on it and to add more material concerning it. The reason I wanted to publish it is that I had a psychotic experience when I was between the ages of 35 and 37, and because I went into analysis, I managed to recover from it. Analysis with a very good psychoanalyst. I doubt that I would have recovered if I had not gotten treatment. And I wanted to provide for the reader both a subjective sense of what a psychotic experience was like in the psychotic break, and also an analytic sense, because frequently people talk in general terms about psychosis without talking about the subjective experience, or psychoanalysts talk about it in a dynamic sense without talking about the subjective experience. I wanted to combine both so the reader, whether a psychoanalyst or hopefully somebody who may not be in this field, can get a sense of what some kinds of psychotic experiences are like and what determines them, what fashions them. Not that it's an organic problem, but more that it's a dynamic problem, often established and usually established when one is very, very young and coming to the fore some years later. So this is a certain type of psychotic experience. It may not be like the psychotic experience of other people, but I tried very hard to get the reader to have a sense of the texture of it and what it was like. The aspects of it which were quite creative and transformative and wonderful, and the aspects of it which were just awful and scary and could have led to even further decomposition. Um, I've been very fortunate in having good analysis and frankly in having enough money to afford good analysis, which is a problem. And I think one of the pleas of the book is that people treat uh, those who've had psychotic experiences intensively. And I was treated for years, 5 times a week. And then I had a subsequent analysis and I became an analyst, and I've been treating patients now for 40 plus years. But I wanted to do something that was unique in that it talked both from a psychoanalytic or psychological point and also from the point of view of the person going through the experience. And I tried very hard to create both of those things. So even though the initial part was written as part of my master's thesis 40 years ago, the rest of it was written more recently, and as you say, it was published in 2022. So I just hope the reader can get a sense of exactly what happened in this particular case.
So yeah, it's a very fascinating structure. Just to be clear, right? I think so the original actual psychotic experience is in your 20s, correct? Is that right?
No, it was from 1967 to 1970, and in 67, I mean, I have to do the arithmetic. I was let me see, I was 42 years, and in 1970, I I was, let's see, I was I still, I was 30, I was 33, 32 years to 30, yeah, 32 years to 37 years. So it wasn't in the 20s. Sometimes psychotic experiences do occur in the 20s.
Oh, this is really interesting because this is, I mean, this is actually already become suddenly more interesting because it was already interesting, but I'm just now because I feel like I was picturing the events in this story. So okay, so just for listeners, right? The book is organized into kind of at least two different pieces. The first piece is like you were saying, Dr. Reichbart, the master's thesis that you wrote, but 8 to 12 years after the experience, was it not? Right. So that was, you wrote that 10 years, a decade after the actual experience, after you had gone through your first analysis, and for the purpose of the academic paper, right?
Actually, I was still in the midst of my first analysis at the time I wrote it.
Oh, you were. Okay. So, and then, the second part of the book were your reflections, like, 50 years later, as you say, in my mind, it's interesting because, you were talking about in the book, um, exiting college and that being a sort of pivotal point because you were leaving a sort of familiar academic environment, right? And you were contemplating it, you were thinking about medical school, and then you switched out of that idea, you applied to law school, you got into that, and then you left that and you tried something else. But it seemed like that was happening in a very rapid, compact period of time. At least that's the way I understood it. So in my mind, it was like, oh, this is happening right after college in the 20s, but I guess not.
No, it didn't. Although many psychotic experiences may be similar to this, but some do happen at that point. And I think I make a point that when one leaves the safe academic setting and is compelled to, I guess, live and sometimes young adults will experience difficulty during that time. So, but yes, even that was a somewhat chaotic time for me. I graduated from Yale College in 1964, and then went off to the University of California at Berkeley, where I was arrested in the free speech movement, then went down south and worked for Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I had gone to California originally to be in playwriting at the University of California. I was a playwriting student, and then I guess to get my bearings, decided to go back and become a lawyer, and went to the safe setting of New Haven, such as it is, and went to Yale Law School for 3 years. So that it was after law school that I that the beginning of the manifestations of the psychotic experience occurred, but really the seeds of it began when I was very, very young. And after law school, my grandfather passed away, and that was kind of the beginning of the psychotic experience. And I tried very hard to indicate how very early experiences, uh, when I was 2, 3, 4, 5, influenced the psychosis that began to manifest itself upon my grandfather's death, in my 30s, I guess. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. So there are several years that occur between the end of college and, and then law school, and then on the end of law school, this really happened. Although, as you say, and you do point out very, very much so, the very early roots of the experience. Could you give a sort of brief summary of what the experience was in your own words?
Oh, Uh, when I was very young, I was raised in the Adirondacks in a small town called Elizabethtown, uh, where my grandfather was a country doctor and my grandmother was a country dentist. And that's where I was born, in Plattsburgh, New York. And that's where I lived when I was very young and used to come back every summer. Uh, but my father was from New York City, and was stationed at the time in Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. And eventually we settled back in New York, in Manhattan. But the fact is, those early experiences where I was with my grandfather and my grandmother, who were so prominent in my development, when I had to leave them, it affected me. This is attachment loss that affected me very greatly without my recognizing the extent to which it affected me. Uh, uh, I happened to be fortunate to have wonderful grandparents, and I was very close to my grandfather and my grandmother. And they're the ones who raised me when, as I said, when I'm very, very young. So when my grandfather passed away after the end of law school, near the end of law school, actually, uh, uh, in 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 the Adirondacks, and uh, uh, I was really devastated in ways that I did not quite realize at the time. It was also a very chaotic time, because this was I graduated in 1968. I was still was could have been drafted, because I wasn't yet 26 at that time. Um, uh, so when uh, when I needed a draft deferment, or I needed there was no way. I was very much opposed to the Vietnam War. I was very lucky to get a draft deferment working for the Navajo and Hopi Indians as a legal service attorney. The organization you mentioned, Dine Be Nana Hilna Be Agadi Tahe, which is probably almost all the Navajo I know, uh, uh, it is in Arizona, New Mexico, and a little slice of Utah where the Navajos and Hopis live. And as a result of working there, I got an occupational draft deferment, courtesy of a fellow by the name of Sam Ervin, later of Watergate fame, because Sam Ervin was the principal sponsor of the Indian Civil Rights Act, which provided Bill of Rights for the Indians, which did not exist prior to that, although he was from North Carolina and was not in general in favor of black civil rights. Nonetheless, I ended up going out to the reservation, and where I'd never been before, nor had any contact with Native Americans before. But the reservation was very much like going back to Elizabethtown, because it was in the country, beautiful, just strikingly beautiful, in different ways than the Adirondacks. And as I went there, I had felt many, without realizing, I was getting more and more depressed when I was going to law school. And when I went there, it was as if I was going out there and being like my grandfather, who had come to the United States from Latvia and had settled in the country in the Adirondacks, and I was going to a new and strange land by myself, which reminded me, because it was outdoors and it was really so beautiful and different in other ways, reminded me of being in Elizabethtown. And slowly I was processing my grandfather's death in a psychotic way, rather than mourning his death as one would do neurotically, and being even more depressed. I was unconsciously, and even consciously, identifying with him, so I kept him alive in a psychotic kind of sense. And over that period of time that I was on the reservation, for a little over a year, uh, I was thinking of myself as being somewhat like my grandfather, and I was feeling ways alive in ways that I had not when I was depressed and neurotic. And in that sense, it was wonderful. I could write poetry. I could sense the outdoors. I could enjoy music in ways that I did not when I was going to law school and prior to that. But I guess fortunately, or fortunately in the long run, you can't. I came down from my psychosis and could not sustain. I was functioning very well for a period of time, could not sustain it, and basically could not sustain it when I became lovers with a Navajo woman, and was at the point where I had to make a commitment to her, and could not do that because I really was not myself entirely, um, and uh, uh, and began to decompensate. Had to put myself in briefly in for about I don't remember how long, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks in an institution, because I was not able to function properly, which I'd been able to do during most of the psychosis, and then went to Denver to find a psychoanalyst, and was in a sense returning to a neurotic state, no longer so identified with my grandfather, but feeling as if I was getting deeply depressed. And fortunately, I went into analysis. But these two states, the neurotic state and dealing with my grandfather's death in a neurotic way, and the psychotic state, were really quite fascinating, even though I was suffering so much. And what I wanted to do was to let people know how it is that somebody can process a death, a loss, psychotically, and then can process it neurotically. The only way to get better ultimately is to be depressed and neurotic and get better that way. Psychosis is a running away in a certain sense, and that's what I discovered. And after years of psychoanalysis, I think I'm more or less together, where I've been able to have that sense of beauty that I had when I was psychotic, and in the same time have the usual neurotic personality that most people have a tendency to most people who are sane, quote unquote, have. So that's I don't know if I've probably
No, that's that's great. That's great. I mean, there's a huge amount to say, really, and you've given some of the broad strokes of it. It seems like, right, and it's interesting, right, because you said at the beginning one of your purposes in writing the book was to combine the subjective experience along with some kind of analytic understanding of what went on, which of course you do very much so. And correct me if I'm wrong, but at least actually in both parts, you kind of subscribe essentially to an interpretive framework which views your psychotic experience as deriving from, like you said, the early attachment loss of your grandparents. And also it seems like you put a big emphasis as part and parcel of that on your disavowed aggressive wishes against your grandparents for having left you.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because when I was rereading it prior to meeting with you, I was impressed with how strongly I made that point, and in fact, I just did a supervision of somebody where I was trying to make the same point. When somebody passes away, we're used to mourning them, but mourning also involves trying to deal with one's aggression that the person has left you, and very often in the general public, we don't talk about that. But as analysts, that's what when somebody is suffering during mourning or during reaction, which may be psychotic, may be neurotic, that has to be the point that's brought out. You get angry at the person for leaving you, and then it gets very complicated because the unconscious doesn't have a sense of time. So you get angry at them for leaving you, and then somehow you feel responsible that they left you. It's the unconscious it isn't rational in that sense. How can you possibly be angry at the person you loved and left you? And maybe they left you because you're angry. I mean, I know it makes no rational sense, but that's how the unconscious works. And it's something that I frequently talk about with patients, and I think it's crucial, and I try to bring it up here. Let me make. There's another thing I wanted to bring up, and I did. This was not in the first part of the writing, but this is in the second part. I don't think it was in. Well, anyhow, but what I wanted to bring up, which I thought was very important, in a different way, when another part of this sense of loss. I lost my grandmother and my grandfather when I was very young, in the sense because I had to move to New York City with my parents. When I was in New York City at the age of 4, I had a black maid. The black maid reminded me, I don't remember her name, I just remember I was 4 years old, reminded me very much of my grandmother because she's maternal in a way that my mother was not. And then she left too, and she left under difficult circumstances. I was 4 years old. She had either a son or a grandson came visit me. The son or grandson, I was 4, had me touch his penis, and then the maid walked in, got all upset, and I think slapped the grandson, and then she disappeared because she didn't come back to work for us. And she felt responsible in some way for the whole thing. That was also tremendously traumatic. And it was a reminder of the maid who's like my grandmother leaves, my grandmother leaves. And the result of this, I was quite a kid. The result of this was this strange story I told. She left. Okay. I guess as best I can reconstruct it, I do remember doing this. I didn't know why I did it, but my mother told me we lived on Central Park West. We lived on the 8th floor overlooking the Central Park West. My mother was home. She told me to go in and take a nap to my room, which had a view of Central Park West. I was trying to be a good boy. I thought, well, I'm not going to go outside my door because I'm supposed to be taking a nap in here. So I decided I was going to open the window, go outside on the ledge, and walk around the whole building and come in into the living room or wherever she was, and that way I would not have violated the rule about opening the door. So I literally, I don't know if there was a guardrail around the window. I literally walked up. I can remember doing this. I was 4 years old. I stepped over the guardrail, and then there's a thinner, if you live in New York City, you know, there's a thinner ledge, going around. There's a big ledge over the window. There's a thinner ledge going around. So I'm over the guardrail, and I'm putting my foot on the thinner ledge, and I don't want to transfer my full weight on it because I'm not too sure I could do it. And meanwhile, down below, there's some guy who's yelling up at me, and there are people looking at me now because he's yelling. I found it very annoying because he was distracting me, because he yelled up at me. And I must have stayed frozen there for quite a while because it gave him time. He was a college student, to take the elevator up to the 8th floor, knock on our door, and come rushing in when when my mother opened the door, and flinging open my bedroom door, and going to the open window and reaching and pulling me in. Why did I do that? I mean, I got severely punished as a result of it, as you can imagine. Anyhow. But why did I do that? And the reason I did it, is reconstructed, is that the maid had left, my grandmother had left. The outdoors looking at Central Park Rest, that reminded me of Elizabeth then. That reminded me of my grandmother. And I was going to go outside in that way. So, in a certain sense, years later, when I go off to the Navajo reservation, I'm in a sense repeating that. I'm trying to, and I was trying to find, and this is another point, I was trying to find the black maid who had disappeared. And that's frequently when nannies or maids leave, we don't recognize how severely kids can suffer in ways they may not even be aware of. So I'm going out to the Navajo reservation to be with somebody, to be with Navajos of darker skin. And that also explains another reason why I went down south and worked for Martin Luther King. I was kept on searching psychologically for that black maid who reminded me of my grandmother. I don't know if I'm saying this correctly.
No. I mean, it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. But so it's interesting, right? Because what you're describing points to something which I wanted to ask you about, namely, like, and you've touched on it already, which is that psychotic has a very pejorative connotation, but but it seems to be, you're saying, it isn't all pejorative. Actually, there's some really rather beautiful aspects to it, right? And what I'm wondering is, well, okay, I have several things I'm wondering, but one thing I'm wondering is, could you, in some sense, have been said to be, have been searching for yourself, right? In a way, that this experience, this psychotic, almost complete breakdown that you have, look, you describe your mother as neglectful in certain ways, right? When you were very young, she let you, she'd be like, why are you playing out on the street when you were 2 years old, 3 years old, these sorts of things, not taking into account her own inattentiveness, I think you say in the book, right? You described your father as being charming, but also manipulative in certain ways, enmeshed in certain ways, controlling in certain ways. You wanted his approval, but you also feared his abandonment, and you were affected. You say very strongly by one period of time when you were very young, and he stopped talking to you because he was upset at you for something, and you didn't realize till decades later how much it had affected you because you feared that was a signal that he was going to leave you, just like your grandparents had left you. And so, it seems like, one way of looking at what's going on, I'm just curious what your take is on this, right? Is that you were, you hadn't had these, you had experiences with a lot of unreliable objects and neglectful objects in your early childhood, right? And you were obviously extremely academically gifted. You were, multi-talented. You could do many, many different things. And you did. And you talk as well about, this very interesting, like you call it, oscillatory pattern between, during your school year, you'd be one way, disciplined, academic, trying to be gentlemanly and scholarly, etc. But then during the summers, you go out into the country, and then you'd have these romances, you'd have friendships, and you'd be more sensual. And then you just like cut that off at the beginning of the school year, so you had these sort of two different pieces of yourself. But what I'm curious, right? Because I mean, I'm wondering to what extent, right, this searching for, the black maid, this searching for your grandparents as you go off to the Navajo reservation was an attempt to break out of some kind of, false self, essentially, perhaps. Could you interpret things in that light? And
Well, I think generally that's right, but I do want to say that this is only one kind of psychosis, and it happens to be one that I recovered from. But psychosis is not necessarily so pretty, It was, in this case, there was some absolutely wonderful aspects of it, but I don't want anyone And I don't think that psychosis is necessarily like this. This is a certain kind of psychosis. And I didn't have hallucinations, but more severe psychoses. And this might have become more severe with time, or I certainly, if I had not gotten, I mean, think about it. I was seen 7 times a week when I first saw this analyst, because and there aren't many analysts like that around anymore, unfortunately. And anyone that is 6 times and then 5 times, that's what saved me. But God knows what I would have looked like or been like had I not been saved. Or if I had even been seen the way people tend to be seen now sometimes, give them some medication. I don't know what I would have been like if I hadn't had that. So yes, it was wonderful in many, many ways. And I still even think about how beautiful there were aspects of it. But but I couldn't hold on to it. You can say that each of these was kind of false, but I don't want somebody to think that it's like uh, 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 it's a shift in personality, but it is not the kind of shift you get when people are fully have multiple personalities. It isn't quite like that, but it felt like that. It felt like when it really felt like I had been in prison when I was in law school and doing those. It felt like that, and gradually as time went on, it felt even more and more like that. And towards the end of law school, after my grandfather's death, I could not function very well. I couldn't read law. I barely got out of Yale Law School at the very end. It was painful to try to be academic in that way. I just yearned for something different, to be the kind of person I remembered I could be. That's why when I actually got a fellowship to work with the Navajo Indians rather than going, which is at the University of Pennsylvania. I had a month fellowship, and then I went out to Arizona. I went to Philadelphia with my fellowship, Reginald Haber's fellowship, to study uh, to study law that supposedly it was really did not pertain to the Navajos. So rather than going through the studies there, I literally took myself out to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, slept outdoors, picked peaches uh, at a farm, dealt with tobacco at a farm. I wanted so much just to be outdoors, to see the outdoors, because I felt I had been trapped in my neurotic kind of personality. And that beginning of that, just to be able to feel the outdoors, and was just, I mean, they all thought I was kind of strange out there, but they let me work. So I loved it, and I loved going out to the reservation. The reservation is actually, for those who have not been there, Monument Valley. You've seen pictures of it. The reservation is just strikingly beautiful, really, in my opinion. It's just amazing. So
But so again, right? So it seems like, right? Because you just said, right? Like, and this struck me, from what you had written too, right? That you felt like in these academic settings that you had been in a kind of prison, and so going to this place of spectacular and otherworldly natural beauty that also connected to, your childhood haunt in Elizabethtown, right, and your connection to grandparents, and also I think what you said beautifully was what you could have been or what you were at one point, essentially. I think you said that actually. So I'm just curious, it's because I guess I'm trying to what I'm guessing trying to put on the table very ineptly is you have one sort of interpretation, which I think you give in your book, of the psychotic experience as resulting from this sort of um weak ego dealing with these really powerful aggressive wishes that it couldn't deal with, couldn't admit to itself, right? But I'm curious about the contrast between that and the story of you were trapped in a sort of life which you felt constricted and imprisoned by, and you had to do anything to desperately escape it and find your true self, which you did eventually, maybe through a means that was suboptimal in certain ways, but, you did go back and connect with nature, and it did strike a profound chord in you. And you talk beautifully about, this, again, you call this part of the psychotic experience, but, the light, the light that you saw, the light that was over everything, and the sensuality of it, and the vividness of your sense experience, and so and you had this, by the way, as well, obviously, this it seems to me, very powerful falling in love experience with Darlene, and you give this beautiful poem on page 30 or 31. If you don't mind, I'm going to read it just because I think it's very telling. It says, "Teach me how to touch your skin and feel it in my fingertips, how to know your hair across my face and your whisper in my ear. For I have forgotten the sand beneath my toes, the mist hanging in the trees, the smell of wet wood. When I was a child, I knew the raindrops, the sand, the wet wood, and I would be a child again if you would teach me." This is something you wrote for Darlene. And so, you went into this otherworldly place and you had this unbelievably powerful, falling in love experience. Um, it seems like, you could view this as a trying to break free from what you were.
Yes, yes, and I and that's what I tried to say. I was trying to break free. But I, and it was a wonderful experience. But there's the flip side of it, which I alluded to before. I, uh, I was always searching for the black maid in a sense, uh, and it had that aggressive aspect to it, which is I was going to show the black maid by leaving her, and that's essentially what I did with Lorette, with Darlene. I had done that previously with. It's not she was not the. I dated a number of black women. It was in women in general. I would leave, because I've been hurt, and you know, so I couldn't quite maintain it with Darlene. I tried so hard and I could not hold it together. Uh, 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 because because I was not I wasn't a full person in a certain sense. I was that part of myself that was psychotic and beautiful, as you say, and I could write poetry and I could write that to her, and I felt so close to her. But there was another part of me that hadn't processed my life, hadn't processed what being close meant, because what somebody that I hadn't been able to process that, you know? So I could not maintain it. And uh, fortunately, Darlene had a wonderful life after I left, and then she left me realizing I couldn't do it either. And when I say I left, I did leave, but when I came back, she'd already left. And that was devastating, because that was like my grandmother leaving again. I lose her again. And that's when I really collapsed, and would think repeated. I could not get her out of my mind. And I would think about what a terrible person I was to leave her. And yet, anyhow, so that's when I ended up in Denver. That was the final breaking point, so to speak. So a lot of this has to do with this early attachment stuff, which we tend to underestimate with all our patients, the importance of it. Uh,
So it's interesting there, right? This attachment, and as well, what got you out of the situation, right? Which, yeah, I'm curious about what you view as a relative roles of insight versus relationship. I mean, obviously, they're tied together, right? Because you have this sort of, again, interpretation of what went on, that you were playing out a certain kind of internal drama in seeking out someone like Darlene and going to a place like the Navajo reservation. And this was what was part of what defines the experience of psychotic, right? That you were using the external world to play out this internal drama, you say. Um, um, and I'm curious, though, with your first analyst, you say what really helped you ultimately, well, you call it in the nature of a transference cure, and you say that you identified with this analyst super strongly, that you adopted, his manner of thinking and writing. And but I mean, to be fair, right, the analyst, it seems like he went out of his way to help you, and he really just, threw open the door 7 days a week. I mean, really, really strove to help you. So it's totally understandable that you would feel an immense connection. I'm curious, I guess what I'm curious about is, this interpretation of your aggressive wishes and other aspects of what happened in terms of your verbal conceptual understanding. How important was that versus how important was the establishment of this very deeply understanding relationship with the sort of idealized father or grandfather type figure in your first analyst?
I don't think the insights would have come without what you're talking about. And that was it's absolutely crucial. That's absolutely crucial. I wouldn't have had the insights. I wouldn't have had that experience. I literally had a shaking experience driving and suddenly realizing that when I was young and my father wouldn't talk to me for a day or two or something like that, that it was like it was devastating. It was like my grandparents leaving me. I wouldn't have had that if I didn't have an analyst actually who reminded me, I think, of my grandfather, an analyst who was there as somebody who wasn't going to leave, who was an attachment, who understood me. I couldn't have had those. I had a number of shaking experiences, but I forgot what the second one. Literally driving the car and shaking when I was driving to see him. These sudden bursts, this bubbling up of recognition of what loss was or what I experienced. But I wouldn't have been able to have those without what you're talking about, without the attachment. And let me add, this is old fashioned, but this analyst, he didn't want me to be on any medications. I think he put me on something very, but he got me off right away. He didn't want things to be disguised the way they are by medication, but he was willing to see me. 7 days, the old fashioned way. I see patients now. I see patients five times a week, the way some analysts do. But I don't think I could have been helped if I had been seen, once or twice a week with medication. I don't think I would ever have gotten to this point. I just don't.
That makes total sense. It makes total sense. I mean, it's so and so to push this point a little further, I'm curious, right? Because I mean, you talk this beautiful paragraph at the end of one of your sections, which you talk about, a couple things, right? And you talk about the psychosis and this sort of visionary gleam, that was very appealing, but also, of course, dangerous, because that's not the right way to get it, right? And you allude, well, you say basically at the end of your main second section, the real way of getting it, which is I'm just going to read this paragraph really quickly. As an analyst, I've experienced that when certain analytic patients manage, after many years of treatment, to finally dispel the depression that permeated their feelings and lives, it is as if a gray scrim between them and the world has been lifted. These patients marvel at seeing the world brightly again, at feeling their bodies alive again, and at experiencing happiness and a connection with the world they had all but forgotten existed. So that experience, which you just described so poetically there, is that fundamentally from, in your opinion, these insights, or are the insights sort of epiphenomenal to the establishment of the relationship? What is driving that change? What drives that change, or is it both?
It's the relationship that drives the change. Actually, that was your first question. It can't happen without the relationship.
Basically, the relationship.
It can't. But that's the wonderful thing about this profession. I have the opportunity to try to help people the way I was helped. Who would think? I mean, my parents knew nothing. I mean, they had books on Freud, but they were anything but devoted to, and they had analyst friends, but they had no interest in analysis. And I went to to college and law school. I had no. I took one psychology 101 course, which was boring as to be, as I recall. It didn't particularly involve Freud. I know nothing about psychology, although I was an English major. So, but once I discovered this field, because becoming a patient, it was like, talk about seeing a new world. It was like all of a sudden things started to make sense. They never. It was just. It was wonderful. And it gave me an opportunity to understand myself. I didn't even think I needed to be understood before prior to that, you know. But it was wonderful. But let me add something else which I didn't add. It wasn't only that I was searching for these objects. I I because I couldn't because I was so angry internally that they left me, I would leave them. When I had a love relationship, I couldn't maintain it. I was unconsciously, I was angry. I was going to leave them because they left me. So that's essentially what happened. That's essentially what I was struggling with Darlene. I could not do it. And I had done that, and I'd hurt some women along the way, not even recognizing what was going on inside me, that I felt so hurt by people leaving, that I was going to hurt them too. And that also is a dynamic that often occurs with patients that patients aren't quite aware of. I mean, I think you're right to talk about the aggression aspect of it. I'm actually, it helps me to see it again, to remind me how important that is. You know, you can be aggressive against somebody you love. You know,
Your analyst, your first analyst, gave you enough love in a sense that you could allow yourself to see those aspects of yourself.
yes, yes, and he was really brilliant. It was, yeah, but it was a very short analysis. It was a little. It was a. I mean, I had to figure out how to live as well. For a while, I was driving a cab, and I dropped out of law entirely. Although for a brief period of time, I was representing Native Americans in Denver uh, as an attorney. But I had to get rid of law entirely. I just had to, and God knows what was going to happen to me, you know. And so I ended up going. I tried to reapply to medical school. They didn't want me, and then I decided, well, I'll become a psychologist and I'll become an analyst. And uh, so I didn't continue the analysis. I came to New York City, and as part of analytic training, you go back into the analysis. I was a little over-identified with my wonderful analyst. I hadn't worked that part through, really. So I had a second analysis with a wonderful woman analyst, and kind of worked that part through more. And that took a number of years, as quite a few years as well. But yes, he was absolutely, I can't begin. He saved my life.
Hmm. It's also interesting you mentioned about the second analyst. Well, a couple of interesting things I just want to point out. Well, one is that she served a kind of maternal function. You said she was less interpretive, and she was more of a maternal figure for you. And she also, it seems like you say in the book, brought out the uh, unworked out aspects of your relationship to your mother.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like that motherly thing played a key aspect in your psychotic experience, or not really?
That's so. Uh, as you mentioned, my mother was. I think I used the words inattentive at times. The inattentiveness, I'll run through it because it's quite striking. It was not only she was upset that I walked out in the street at 2 years old or 3 years old or something like that. It was also and this also, I mean, there is, I suppose it's kind of amazing I survived. No, we, in the Elizabethtown, in the house that we were in, in where my grandfather had his office, and my grandmother had her dental office. My grandfather had his doctor's office. I guess she wasn't paying much attention to me. I decided at the age of one and a half or two, or I'm a little unclear, to wander around. And of course, if you have a dental office and a doctor's office there, you can wander into it. I wandered into it at the age of I must have been just toddling. And there happened to be a bottle. I don't remember this, but I do remember the results of it. There happened to be a bottle of acid on a table. I'm a little kid. I reach up to the bottle, knock the bottle down. The acid goes all over my chest. The acid goes all over this right arm. Right arm, fortunately, missed my face. And my grandfather happened to be there and had to wash it off. But I have permanent scars on my chest. Can't see them very much now, but when I was younger, they were quite red, and on my elbow. And uh, so, uh, so my mother frequently was not around, which probably she should have been. And she had a tendency I learned poetry from her. I learned she loved she loved to read, but she was not the maternal figure that my grandmother was. She didn't like to cook. She was a lousy cook. My grandmother was a wonderful cook. I did things in the kitchen as a child, grinding the meat and all those kind of things with my grandmother, but my mother would have nothing to do with it. She was a lawyer and she wasn't going to get trapped in that. So yes, I suppose I was certainly searching for that kind of maternal thing. And I think you're probably right. I think this analyst I chose was a much more maternal thing, certainly more maternal than my mother in that sense. My mother was wonderful. It's what she didn't do that was not so good. What she did do was fine. What she didn't do was not so good. And as a result, there were times when we had children, we did not trust her alone with the kids. We just, you know, you know. But she taught me literature. She there was a beautiful. She wrote poetry. There was something wonderful about her. I adored her, but she was not there for the early childhood stuff. That was not. She was not good at that. Once I was verbal, I think she was much better.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, very, very fascinating. I want to actually ask you about something which is now a little, well, I don't know how related it is. I'm curious because I know you have a very strong interest in parapsychology. And I want to know if you do you feel like there's any connection? Is there any way of interpreting your psychotic experience in that framework? Do you think about it that way at all or no?
Well, let me add, I didn't put this in the book because once you start to talk about parapsychology, then I didn't want it to focus on that.
I know.
I don't think it had anything to do with this experience, nor with my treatment. In terms of what I'm discussing, it's a little more complicated. It's a little more complicated than this. The fact is, my analyst was a foremost writer in parapsychology, absolutely foremost. He is it was terribly controversial and continues to be. And he wrote a book called The World of Ted Serios. I don't know if you ever heard of it.
No.
So he was very much involved in telepathy and telekinesis and everything. He was a foremost analyst before supposedly he fell off the deep end, according to and was a New York psychoanalytic New York psychoanalytic. I forgot what it's called, New York Psychoanalytic Institute. That's right. In the city, was a member of the American, was a member of the International, and was very well known for his writing that had nothing to do with telepathy or telekinesis. But then that he explored, and I really learned from him. And it was part of my analysis in terms at times, but it wasn't central to this. And I wanted to make a real point of not making it central to this because I wanted to just speak about what the psychotic experience was. However, in terms of my own development, I continued as an analyst to practice in this in the same way he does. That's the reason you see the book, The Paranormal Surrounds Us. We just had back in what in 6 months ago or so, we had a big conference which involved analysts from France and Brazil and Israel and Hungary, dealing with telepathy and psychoanalysis. And there's a book that I'm editing forthcoming called that by Routledge that collects all the recent articles in that. So that's why I got involved in, I guess people call parapsychology or whatever. But frankly, this experience that I write about, he was a wonderful analyst. Forget about the parapsychology or anything. He was just as you described. He was wonderful. I did learn to think in a certain way. I did learn to process things, telepathic dreams and things like that, which I never would have had before. I feel very fortunate I had that experience. Some people think I'm a sugar, but it hasn't hurt me in terms of my development as an analyst. But in order to survive, because he had a hell of a time, it is only as I got older that I began to publish to publish psychoanalytic articles that were available to my colleagues in that thing I had published in parapsychological journals prior to that. But that's a whole different sphere. But it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, people think of my analyst as a parapsychologist. Frankly, as an analyst, I couldn't have had anybody better. I really couldn't have. But I don't think this experience had anything to do with parapsychology myself.
Okay, and I was just curious because I mean this again, the beautiful description you have of that sort of visionary gleam and the light. It feels there's a certain element of it that feel. You even use this word at some point in the book. There's a mystical element to it.
I did use the word mystical. I get very scared about using mystical because people it's a little too soft for me. So I did at one point use that. Really. But I can't tell. I've had, I felt honored to be among the Navajo, and there were times I'm not a religious person, but I would go to, I'd be almost the only white person there. I'd go to one of their ceremonies in the middle of the semi-desert with a hogan there treating somebody, and they would go through their dances and things, and it would be in the outdoors, and it was as religious as anything I've ever encountered. I mean, there were some marvelous aspects of that experience, and I've written also about the Navajos who happen to also believe in things we would call parapsychological, and have a different way of thinking about mental illness. So all of that was a wonderful aspect of the experience, but the central part of what I'm talking about is not there. But let me tell you, in terms of my analyst, it's not only that I processed this, I learned to look at the world in a different way. I had no interest whatsoever in things parapsychological prior to this. Never had occurred to me. And just as it never occurred to me to go into therapy or psychoanalysis, it was all new. This was also part of the new world. I was very lucky. Despite taking terrible chances without even recognizing I was taking them, I was very lucky to come out of it, the other side of it. I have a career. I've treated patients. I've been president of my institute not once but twice. None of that would have happened without him. None of that.
Do you feel like you have, again, the beauty of that psychotic experience, especially in the earlier stages? Do you feel like, and again, I sort of already asked you this, but I'm going to ask you again to be absolutely certain here. Do you feel you have been able to obtain full access to it in a more integrated way? All the energy, all that beauty that was there, do you feel you have total access to it now?
Not as much as I. There have been times when I'm getting a little older, and it's a little. There have been times, but I don't think I have quite as much contact with it as I. But I think that's partly. I'm an old guy, you know. I'm serious. No, so the poetry, because there's poetry in the poetry doesn't come easily anymore. Uh, I write short stories. That's what they don't come quite as easily anymore. Um, uh, I don't know. It, but there have been times when I felt I was more integrated in that sense. Uh, you get old, you start to worry about other things. I'm serious. You know. Uh, but
It's
but
fundamentally just you feel like it's fundamentally that sense of beauty is just fundamentally organic, and it's just blocked in certain ways, correct?
it can get blocked in certain ways. I really wish, if you're talking about the way in which I was raised, and going to law school and do it, I really, if the sense of beauty in things, I mean, is really associated in my mind a little bit with my mother, who was a poet. Um, uh, I wonder if my father had not been so determined for me to have a career as a doctor, or it was really and had permitted me to be more follow my own bent a little more. Maybe I would have been able to incorporate those. Maybe I would have been an artist. Maybe it would have been something else. That might have happened. But he certainly controlled things from my point of view, and maybe that was the sense of uh, of being in prison. I think the virtue of psychoanalysis is you can do both things. You can write, you know. So that's been, and the other thing is, I think despite myself, I think there's always been a desire to understand and help people. So one way or another, I would do that. But I'm not too sure I ever would have thought. I might have thought about being a doctor because I wanted to be by my grandfather, but I don't know if I would have gone. I don't know. I don't know. My father was so determined for me to get good grades that he sometimes kind of lost track of me. You know?
Yeah. That I think that comes through in the book, 100%. So Dr. Reichbart, this has been a delightful conversation. I want to give you a chance. I know this is a very rich book, and there's, I feel like probably many details we haven't fully covered. But is there anything else about the book you'd want our listeners to hear that we haven't touched on?
Not really. I just hope that somebody that people will read it. That's just the hope. And I'm very grateful for your asking me to do this and for your questions.
Well, I'm very honored that you have been our guest, and I want to also say to any listeners that this is actually not only is it a very rich book, but it's actually fairly short. So it's not a huge commitment, and it's very unique. I feel like this idea of this, having captured something at an early point in life and then reflecting on it later, and the subjectivity plus the analytic knowledge at multiple points in your life, bearing down on it is really very interesting. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.